Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Clementine Starling, Director of the Atlantic Council's Forward Defense Program in the Scowcroft Center. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's event, Prevailing in an Age of Danger. Today's discussion will explore how the United States and its allies and partners can craft strategies and policies to meet the complex and dynamic security challenges we face today. I'd like to thank our speakers and our audience for joining us. A special thanks to Thom Shanker and Andy Hoehn, who recently released a book titled Age of Danger, Keeping America Safe in an Era of New Superpowers, New Weapons, and New Threats. Their book serves as the catalyst for today's discussion. Here at the Atlantic Council, our Scowcroft Center for Strategy and Security works to develop sustainable, nonpartisan strategies to address the most important security challenges facing the United States and its allies and partners. Within the Scowcroft Center, Forward Defense identifies the defense strategies, capabilities, and resources the US and its allies need to deter and, if necessary, prevail in future conflict. As the 2022 National Security Strategy makes clear, the US is in an era of strategic competition, and that competition is heating up. Russia's ongoing war in Ukraine and Beijing's increasingly overt threats towards Taiwan are heightening the security dynamic and driving national security planning and strategy. Alongside emerging military threats, the US is also contending with non-military challenges, from cyber attacks, pandemics, and the ever-present threat of climate change. How can US national security leaders design strategies to compete with near-peer competitors while also balancing their responses to global and cross-border security threats? As Thom and Andy put it, the future needs a seat at the table. Yet today's national security apparatus is still designed to address past priorities and an era defined by counterterrorism missions. Today's events will consider how the US, and particularly the DoD and intelligence community, ought to adapt their approaches to meet 21st century challenges. I'm pleased to be joined by many distinguished speakers for today's event. First, General Richard Myers, who served as the 15th chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He served 2 decades in the US Air Force, leading an esteemed career as a combat pilot and commanding operations across the Indo-Pacific and North America, as well as with the Space Command. General Myers will provide his perspective on how US leaders should weigh 21st century defense priorities. So thank you for joining us. Following that, I will sit down with Thom Shanker and Andy Hoehn, the authors of Age of Danger, who will share their key takeaways and insights from their book. Between Thom and Andy, they have a wealth of experience. Thom was assistant Washington editor for the New York Times. He's a veteran journalist for nearly 25 years. Today, he's the director for the Project for Media and National Security at George Washington University. And I'm lucky enough to call him a non-resident senior fellow with the Scowcroft Center here at the Atlantic Council. And Andy served in multiple roles in previous US administrations, including as Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Strategy. And today, Andy is Senior Vice President for Research and Analysis at the RAND Corporation. The second part of our event, we'll have an expert panel unpacking key challenges and opportunities for the US and its allies to prevail in this age of danger, including John Culver, a non-resident fellow with the Atlantic Council's Global China Hub, Jacqueline Levy, the Director of US Policy at the AMR Action Fund, Erin Sikorsky, the Director for the Center for Climate and Security, and last but not least, Tom Wingfield, a Senior International Defense Researcher at the RAND Corporation. And this panel will be moderated by Helene Cooper, a Pentagon correspondent with the New York Times. So before I turn it to General Myers, just a couple of reminders. This event is public and on the record. I really encourage our audience to participate by going to askac.org and submitting your questions for the panelists. Please identify yourself and your affiliation. Helene and I will attempt to pose as many of those questions as possible to our panelists today. And join the conversation online via AC Scowcroft and use the hashtag #ForDefense. Thank you all for joining us. With that, I will hand it over to General Myers.
Thank you, Clementine. Well, it's an honor to join everybody today for this really important topic, prevailing in an age of danger. I don't think we have enough time to kind of do it justice, but it'll be maybe be a good start. We've got many threats to deal with, for sure. And this is an age of danger. I'm going to focus on kind of one subset of those, and it's one of the chapters in Thom and Andy's book, and that's the threat, the biological threat, or agri-bio threat. I want to bring the food piece into this as well, because my bookends on this timeline is, as chairman, being alarmed when you see Al-Qaeda and their ilk experimenting with biological weapons in the very north part of Iraq, kind of late after we went into Afghanistan, and then in Afghanistan as well. Very interested in this form of warfare. And then, of course, being here in Washington, D.C., when anthrax was used and injured a lot of people and killed, I think the number was 5 people. And then debating in the armed forces, fortunately we had a vaccine handy, right? So we could vaccinate all our armed forces, and we did that. Then we had to stop for when USDA shut down the plant, we had to start up again. A lot of debate about whether or not we should require people in uniform to get the vaccine. But we, I think, eventually did that, and they did as well. And then I retired in 2005, and in 2005, and then in 2016, found myself at Kansas State University. And that was not on my radar. It was not particularly a goal, but it was a fulfilling experience once I got there and got involved. That's another story. But they were really focused at K-State on the agri-bio issue, food production, animal health. There's one scientist there that says we're only one pathogen, plant pathogen away from starvation on the planet. And then he'll quickly say, well, this is exaggeration. It's not out of the realm of possibility, but it's probably not going to happen. But that shows you how close we are to some serious events taking place in all our lives. I think our attention to the bio threat really peaked when we saw non-nation state actors using it, like Al-Qaeda and others. I happened to be in Japan in the mid-'90s when Shinriko used sarin gas in the subways and killed people and injured lots of people as well. I was told by my driver that we were well equipped for that kind of problem. He said, we have gas masks in the trunk. I didn't know they'd ever been out of the trunk. And I'm pretty sure, besides those training in the military, even knew how to use them. But at least it just highlights the whole point that this isn't necessarily something a nation-state actor would use, but non-nation-state actors could use biological weapons on agriculture or people and have devastating effects. I'm going to talk about 2 areas today around this particular threat. One's going to be around warning, and one's going to be around what actions possibly we should take. Around warning, when you read a lot of the documents around the threat from biological weapons or pandemics, naturally occurring pandemics and so forth, a lot of the reliance is on surveillance. You'll read this term all throughout all these papers, PDs on all this issues, and I think that's not going far enough. If you're just relying on surveillance, then you become reactive. You see something happen, you react, but doesn't mean you're going to be working on preparedness all through that time. To know what's around the next corner requires real experts in this field. And that some of those are in government, many are in university settings, many are in the private sector. And those all have to come together to look around the corner and try to help understand and maybe even predict what's coming our way. I know that's one of the most difficult chores we ever have in the intelligence community in the United States, but it's one that we ought to really focus on. A model for this might be the fusion center in the state of Kansas. Every state had a fusion center after 9/11 based around terrorism. The one in Kansas focuses on bioagri-terrorism and bioagri events and just food, animal and plant safety. What makes it unique, according to those who had visited, and several secretaries of Homeland Defense and so forth had visited and said nobody else has anything like that, is that we have all those actors there. We have federal actors, state actors, the private sector, university experts, all come to meet and try to figure out, okay, what's around that next corner, or what are we seeing that we need to take some stand on or some action against. One example was with the National Bioagri Defense Facility going up in Manhattan, Kansas. They had ribbon cutting, I think, last week. When that was being built, people were starting to apply for positions. One of the people that was applying for a position had her PhD in one of the biosciences and looked like a perfect candidate to come out and work in that environment. As the Fusion Center dug further, they were able to trace her travels and her employment to terrorist organizations. So if it hadn't been for them working the details of this and looking beyond just the obvious, that person could be on a staff doing some very sensitive research in the middle of our country. So we have to do a better job of fusing our intelligence. Typically, that's not what we're strong at. When working through some of the mandates in the PD on bioagri security, you find out very quickly that USDA does not have enough people there and resources that have the right clearances to even read the intelligence and know what might be coming. Now, that may have changed since the last time I looked, which was probably 4 years ago. I don't know. But at the time, they just didn't have enough people that could even look at what is the intel saying, or access to this intelligence that was saying what's coming down the pike. So I'd say the first thing that we have to think about when it comes to bioagri-terrorism is surveillance is not enough. We got to be more proactive. We have to make it a priority in the intelligence community. How hard is that, given all they have to do, all the other threats out there? The age of danger, list a lot of them. They have a lot of priorities, but this one is a big one, and they ought to be paying attention to it as well. Organization. James Monroe can rest contented that his goal of having a U.S. government that is not too efficient has been achieved. And we saw that, of course, I've seen it through most of my government years, but particularly when I was in senior positions. We are not very efficient when it comes to national security, and that's unfortunate. There appears to be a lot going on with bioagri security, but there is not a coherence in terms of priorities or where resources should be going. So who's on the team that's looking at the bioagri threat? Well, you can put all the intel agencies there. Somebody's probably looking at pieces of it. USDA, DOD, DHS, HHS, they all have a role to play, and they've all been outlined in these HSPDs that say, here's what you ought to do, here's what you ought to do. I have a problem with that, and I'm not sure that we've done a good job of outlining who's in charge, who has the responsibility, the authority, and then can be held accountable for how we do in this area. You know, one of the things you find out very quickly, and I know they do this, and I just hope they go far enough in these tabletop games. We were part of those in DOD, and right before Katrina, a couple of years before that, we ran a big one on a natural disaster, like Hurricane Katrina. And the game was run by another department, as it should have been. But when FEMA and the federal government ran out of ideas in this game, they said, well, now we'll turn those issues over to the Department of Defense. Game stopped. Nobody asked the Department of Defense, here's what we need from you. We need communications, we need vehicles, we need whatever it is we need, security. Nobody ever asked. And that's what you saw when you got Katrina, right? The Defense Department was brought in fairly late in any planning. I think did okay, but it was pickup ball. So one of the things we could find out very quickly by putting everybody who thinks they have something to do with bioagra issues is to play a tabletop game. They're relatively cheap, and figure out where the fault lines are in our thinking. I'll give you two examples of where I've seen an organization where you make somebody responsible, give them the authority, and hold them accountable. Really worked in this government. One was in the 90s in the Clinton administration when we were trying to deal with Russia and the expansion of NATO. And the president, through the State Department, says he wanted Strobe Talbot to lead a group to work all those issues that were on the table at the time with Russia, with NATO, and all that resulted in a summit with Yeltsin and Clinton. And I think that was in '96. That was 97, sorry, 97. That was putting one person in charge. I was the representative from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I could go to those meetings. If I didn't like something, a direction they were going, a policy they were going to put forward in these negotiations, I had 24 hours to get back and with the chairman's words on that. And then they moved on. They didn't wait for anybody. You had 24 hours to get your senior person to weigh in, or we're moving on. That worked really well there. The other example I would use is where it didn't work so well. Obviously, I was very involved in Afghanistan and Iraq. And I would ask, rhetorically, who was in charge of the Iraq War? Well, it was not the president. He's got too many things to do. The answer is there was nobody, like I described there, like a Strobe Talbot, that had not only the responsibility, but the authority, and then to be held accountable for what was going on in the Iraq War, or even, for that matter, Afghanistan. So trying to harness all instruments of national power, move forward without somebody being responsible and having the authority and being so designated, I think really hurts us. So I think those are a couple of models, one bad, one good, that could be used as we look forward in this bioagra issue. I think I'll just end by saying, lack of readiness here can have dire circumstances, whether it's man-made or for that matter, natural. And we've got to be ready for those. Here's what President George W. Bush said in June of 2002. We must confront the danger with openness, eagerness, and unrelenting purpose. So my question would be, are we attacking this danger with eagerness and unrelenting purpose? Or are we just saying, well, it's really too hard to do, we're just going to let that move on? You can look at all these dangers that are outlined in their wonderful book and make your own decision on that. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Clementine.
Thank you so much, General Myers. And I'm so pleased to be sat down here with Thom and with Andy. Congratulations on the launch of your book. So this is my copy, Age of Danger. I wanted to start with talking about the title, Age of Danger. What made you choose that as the title of your book? How do you think that characterizes today's security environment? And what do you think is different about the threats we face today from those we've faced in the past?
Well, Andy and I started this idea 4 or 5 years ago. We were having a series of dinners at a Lebanese restaurant near the Pentagon. At the time, we were looking really at listing the ticking time bombs that we thought weren't getting enough attention. And as we got deeper and deeper into it, we realized that we really are in a new age, not just a bipolar world, but there are now two rivals with nuclear weapons. The threats are coming faster. Alliances then were in trouble. And Andy and I realized that we wanted to describe this current era as the United States was still focused like Zoom on terrorism, to advocate a more panoramic definition of national security as we describe in our book.
I think the problems that Thom and I examined, one of the conclusions that we came to is we weren't seeing us resolving issues. So you can look at the past and see for a moment that you've got a set of issues here, and those get resolved or managed or maybe lowered, temperature going down. as we were looking at these time bombs, we were watching them add up, and it was really adding up to this moment of danger.
Right. So in the book, and I'm going to quote from the back here because I love this description of your book, an urgent look at how America's national security machine went astray and how it fails to keep us safe and what we can do to fix it. So pretty important stuff. In the book, you explain the role of the US national security apparatus as being twofold. First, a warning machine in which the intelligence community detects threats for the United States. And then second, an action machine, which often is the Department of Defense responding to those threats or crises as they emerge. Can you explain how that twofold nature of the machine works in practice today? And where are there gaps in this national security apparatus as a whole today?
First off, to our policy community, we engage in some simplification, but we did it for a reason, which is problems have to be identified. They have to be followed. General Myers just gave us a good sense of one of the problems that we look at, but we've got a whole array of them. And we think of warning coming from the intelligence community. It does, but there are a lot of sources, a lot of inputs for decision making, the warnings that are coming and how they think about that. And we really wanted to look at that as the overall apparatus or the machine that's sending signals to decision makers, not only that we have a problem, but when that problem might arrive and in what form might that arrive. But decision makers can only handle a problem if they have a place to put it. That is the action side of it. You mentioned the Department of Defense, and we have a lot of recommendations for how warning to action with the Department of Defense ought to work. But it's a lot of the other problems where the action machine hasn't even been built. And those are the things that worry us. So when we talk about pandemic preparedness, we saw some things work reasonably well during the pandemic. We saw a lot of other things that didn't work well at all. And we know from what General Myers was just telling us about the bioagro threat that when it comes to action in issues like broader health preparedness, there's a federal role, there's a state role, there's a local role. There are a whole series of actors involved. And if that idea of preparedness hasn't been thought about ahead of time, if the training hasn't taken place, if we haven't invested in the right kind of resources to pull that together, then we're left with pickup games. And that's the thing that really worries us, is that one thing to be warned, and we have to look at a lot of sources of warning, it's quite another to be able to have an action apparatus that allows decision makers to then take action and not rely on pickup games for carrying out what really needs to be done for the security of the American people.
Thom, do you want to add anything to
Well,
that?
one thing I would say, Andy and I described the warning machine and the action machine, and there was a line that Andy wrote in our conclusion that we swapped the chapters back and forth, and when I read it, it hit me like an epiphany. It's that we may be talking about machines, Clementine, but we're really talking about people. And I don't want to sound like a 10th grade political science class here, but it's really important to get the right people in the right jobs. And this country is not safe if it's broke. This country is not safe if it's polarized. It's not safe if it's paralyzed. So Andy and I are apolitical. The Atlantic Council is apolitical. But if there's one takeaway, each of us as citizens, we have to look to the right people to put in these jobs, whether at the ballot box or through appointments.
So one of the many types of crises that you cover in the book, and I really encourage people to read it because it's such an accessible book, and you cover so many different types of national security issues that are very complex, but in a really digestible and thought-provoking way. But one of the types of crises that you address is pandemics, and obviously General Myers was just talking about biothreats. It's pretty important for all of us who have lived through COVID-19 is thinking about our preparedness for pandemics. And you found through your research and interviews that the US and other countries really failed to properly implement the lessons from the N1H1 epidemic and the Ebola crises in preparing for COVID-19. So how can past examples inform US responses to future crises? Are there limitations in applying past lessons? And can you point to any successful examples where we have heeded the lessons of past crises and brought them forward?
Well, let's start with a success that I think we all have to be thankful for, and that is in the aftermath of, really, we're going to go back to anthrax that we heard about earlier today in this discussion. That's when the real research on the mRNA vaccine, sort of that set of activities that led to a vaccine that, yes, we had it within a year, but if it wasn't for the work that was started 15 years before that, we wouldn't have had this vaccine in the record amount of time. So science can be put in motion, we can bring about results, but it requires continuous activities. That's one of the successes. The worrisome part, though, and you pointed to H1N1, Ebola, and whatnot, we've had enough signals that there was a problem here, and still there was chaos as all this began. And this is where the notion of readiness really comes out. I think the U.S. military gets this right. And if you were to ask a soldier or a Marine about Task Force Smith and what happened in the early days of the Korean War, they would know we sent an unready force into combat, and we know what the results were. Yet, when it comes to things like health preparedness in the country, we're asking people, we're sending unready forces into their own form of combat. And if we don't organize and train and people know who it is they're going to be working with when the moment of these crises arise, then we're going to face the similar kind of situations. And so this is an area that Thom and I really try to explore really toward the end of the book is, what do we do about it? And one thing we can begin to do about it is take a page out of how the U.S. military thinks about this. Joint task forces, identify who the people are, organize them, let them interact, let them know who each other are along the way. It doesn't have to be constant, but that phone call that comes in that moment of need, this is not where we want people to be introduced to each other.
I am receiving some audience questions here, so I am going to pepper them in. So keep them coming. Askac.org is how you submit them. But Andy, the US has really reinvigorated its focus on China. In the NDS, the Pentagon says China poses the most comprehensive and serious challenge to US national security. But in the book, you assess that the US is still ill-prepared to deter or, if necessary, prevail in a conflict in the Indo-Pacific. What has brought you to this conclusion? And how does the US need to adapt its strategy to effectively compete vis-a-vis China?
Well, I'm deeply, deeply worried about this. And I was really delighted when you asked General Myers to be our keynote. He was chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff in 2001 when we undertook a strategy review. This is before 9/11. And it was in that, I was head of strategy in the Office of Secretary of Defense at the time. And we were beginning to focus on China. Nobody was there to declare it yet, but there was this concern that there was this problem out there. We thought it was a decade or 2 decades away, and this was the moment in which we were to begin those preparations. Of course, 9/11 arrived. We had to respond to it. We had to respond. And China gets put on the back burner in a way, and we try to explore in the book. There are reasons for it. There's a business community in this country that's very concerned that, we don't want to be pushing too hard on this. There's business to be done there. But then a decade later, even the business community is turning, but we haven't yet turned the machine. This is the action machine. We don't yet have the pieces in place. And all the while, the tremendous advantage, military advantage we had vis-a-vis China in the late 90s, early 2000s is eroding. And it's eroding year by year by year till we get to the point of later in the second decade of this century, by 2015 and whatnot, people are really concerned that this tremendous advantage we have is waning, and we're approaching parity, or maybe worse. We're going to hear from one of the panelists who we quote here, John Culver, has this great line that there was an American way of war, and China figured it out. And we quote a senior Air Force general in the book who talks about the war games that were being run, and he says the one thing that we were learning was how to lose faster. And this is one in which I think it is well within the ability of our system, of the action machine, to come up with the right answer, but it needs to get moving. And here, I think the line I really want to accentuate is the slowness. We know what to do, we just have to get on with it. And the slowness is something that really has to end. So when you talked about urgency in the introduction, here's a case for some urgency.
So we have an audience question here, just keeping with the theme of China for a moment, from Shanlei Deng, and apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. So obviously the upcoming Shangri-La security dialogue is coming up. China refused a US proposal for a meeting between the Chinese and US defense secretaries. Is this a setback for the recent détente between the two countries in terms of the resumption of high-level communications? And what should the US do about this moving forward?
Well, certainly a setback, right? I mean, I think whatever the situation, you want communications to be open. There's nothing worse than that. I think you keep trying and trying and trying. I mean, we have to extend the offer to be communicating at all levels at any time. So I saw the same news over the weekend and, was frustrated, but I had to get over that frustration and then let myself think, so we got to keep asking, and we're going to keep trying. And, the worst thing we could have is no dialogue. So we have to open up that channel wherever we can, and if we can't get it there, then we ought to try it somewhere else, but we need to be in conversation.
So Thom, pivoting to Russia now, Russia has been described as an acute threat in the national security strategy, and the war in Ukraine is obviously shows kind of Russia's intention to really destabilize European security at really awful costs. But the war in and of itself has revealed some shortcomings in Russia's military strategy. Does the war in Ukraine teach us anything new about Russia's approach to warfare, or about how the US should prepare to meet the modern battlefield?
Thanks. People are always asking me, is there a new Cold War with Russia? And that's the wrong question, because Russia is at war with us today. It's at war with Europe, it's at war with the United States, it's in a hot war in Ukraine. Think about, election interference. That was regime change, an attempt at, right? That's an act of war. The problem with American and their understanding of Russia, just as Andy said that China figured out our way of war, we have not figured out Putin's way of war. The value of our democracy, one of its great blessings, is we are, it's hard to take this country to war. We're either at peace, we're at war. Not so Putin. He has a rheostat, sort of, soft war, medium war, hot war, that he can tune up and down whenever he wants. And we just have not figured out how to counter that. And sadly, this nation has willfully blinded itself to Russia. After the collapse of communism, I was on the ground in Moscow. It was a very hopeful moment, but we deluded ourselves into thinking Russia's going to enter the family of nations. It's going to be a stable democracy. The country just didn't have what it took, and it certainly didn't have the right leaders. And so coming out of it, you have not a new communist party with Putin, he's just a new czar. And we have willfully blinded ourselves, one, with wishful thinking, and two, by ignoring the obvious. Putin's famous speech at the Munich Security Conference, 2007, he declared his opposition to America becoming a hyperpower, and he promised to stand up against US actions everywhere in the world. He described Russia's role in dominating its near abroad. He talked about Georgia, which he invaded a year and a half later. He talked about Ukraine, the first invasion, 2014, of Crimea. We interviewed the 4-star Air Force general who was commander of NATO in 2014 when Putin first invaded Ukraine. He told us he had zero tactical warning, none whatsoever, complete surprise. He was so angry, he flew back to Washington, convened with the nation's intelligence leaders, and they told him, bad on us. On the day before the Berlin Wall fell, there were 15,000 intelligence analysts looking at the Soviet Union. The day before the 2014 invasion of Ukraine, that number dropped to 1,000. The day before the Berlin Wall fell, 50% of the intelligence community budget was focused on the Soviet Union. The day before the invasion of Ukraine, that had fallen to 15%. So we did this to ourselves to focus on counterterrorism, thinking that Russia was no more than Upper Volta with rockets. We let Putin become Putin.
Well, those numbers are stark when you lay it out that way. Is this just a numbers game? Is this just we have a multitude of threats, the US does as a nation and as allies and partners too. Is part of this not knowing where to focus? Is this a problem of we are slow moving in transitioning away from 2 decades of counterinsurgency operations? What really is the problem here? Because it's shocking, I think, to hear from someone in charge of operations in Europe not having any warning ahead of 2014. I mean, what do you think? Obviously, there are a multitude of challenges, but if you're to really characterize what we need to change in the national security machine, what do you think it is?
Well, a couple first thoughts, and I'll let Andy, I hate quoting Stalin to criticize Putin, but Stalin said, mass has a mass all its own. And when you absolutely, cut our budget, looking at the Soviet Union and take the number of analysts down by, 90%, we are going to blind ourselves. In our book, Andy and I make the case, somewhat surprisingly to many, we don't think we need to spend more money on national defense. There's ample money there. We are not the Washington mainstream saying, more money for the Pentagon, but we want it spent smarter. And we can't just have this pendulum swing like after 9/11, Zoom-like focus on terrorism, the panorama went away. Andy and I argue we have to have a nonstop, 24/7 panoramic definition of national security.
I think wishful thinking is another problem here. And so if you look at some of the debate about Russia that took place between 2005 and say 2015, so we'll get past the moment of Crimea, there was a lot of expectation that Russia might be something other than it was. And I think we have to be very careful about wishful thinking in this area. And I agree with Thom. If we need to spend more money, let's do that. But let's spend the money we're using now as wisely as we can. So let's start there to figure out how we're spending the money. And then if the conclusion is we need to spend more, then let's do that. But let's not start necessarily on the assumption that everything needs more money. I think it's where you spend your attention is the first question.
So, and this is I have a related question, although it's not quite about the defense budget and spending. But we obviously seeing an increase in non-traditional, non-military challenges. A big part of the book focuses on those kinds of threats. And often those fall out of the traditional remit of the Department of Defense. But DoD has the largest portion of the budget of any department or agency. In the book, you give an example of a 2021 cyber attack on a Florida water plant and how that cyber attack was scuppered but could have escalated into being a biothreat. And I think that is a good example of cross-cutting threats. And I think what you talk a lot about is the ways in which other US departments or agencies beyond DoD and the IC may be better situated to lead in responses to those kinds of cross-cutting threats, but they might not actually be designed to do so. I think you mentioned the CDC as just one example, was not built as a crisis response machine. How can DoD's interagency counterparts be adapted to support the national security apparatus in times of crisis? And does this require a change in mission? Does it require, a different approach to the way we think about crises and who leads on what when?
I'll begin here, and I know Thom will have more to say. This is a huge topic, so we're going to barely get into it. We do try to explore it in depth in the book. The first place I'd start is what we heard in General Myers' talk, and that is you have to assign responsibility, and with that comes authority. We have to be clear who's in charge. And once the who's in charge element has been framed, then the parties in charge have to either be given the resources or have access to the resources. This is the joint task force idea. They don't necessarily have to control everything, but they have to have the authority to mobilize those resources when called upon. You do reference the Defense Department here, and of course it is receives the most spending of any of the agencies, and we would expect the Defense Department to be involved in some of these other kinds of problems. But let's not kid ourselves. If they're involved on some of these other problems, then they may not be ready, they may not be available to respond to some of their other primary missions. So we have to, I think, be clear about authority, who has it, and responsibility. We then have to build the right mechanisms. That has to be we have to have a training apparatus, so the training is in place. Back to the point, you better know who to call when the crisis arises. And I want to raise one last point that we uncovered time after time. We met people in these other agencies, and they would talk about the feast and famine moments, where during an upsurge in a potential crisis, funds would flow and then funds would erode. And so this notion of feast or famine, that is, in the moment, resources are available, maybe not ample, but they're certainly available. But then when the moment fades, the resources fade, the crisis arises, and we're now find they're under-resourced. I think we have to get, in these crucial areas we're talking about, we have to get past this notion of feast or famine when it comes to resourcing.
Just a quick foot stomp to what Andy said. One of the central arguments of our book is that when you define national security too narrowly, your responses are too narrow. And cyber is exactly a case. Look, I've been guilty of writing the phrase cyber war and cyber warfare too often, but that makes it sound like a military matter, only for the military. We talked about a cyber Pearl Harbor, a military analogy. Lights off on the East Coast, the financial system going down. Andy and I argued that cyber Pearl Harbor has already happened, and it was silent, and it was the Chinese theft of intellectual property worth hundreds of billions of dollars, and nobody even really cared about it. And if you look at China's newest stealth fighter, gosh, it looks an awful lot like ours. And so the solution to that can't be a military operation. It has to be a partnership with the private sector, working hand in glove with the government to counter these cyber threats.
So bouncing off of that point, Thom, which I think is a really important one, because a big part of the understanding the threats portion of the machine is having kind of information and intelligence at our fingertips, right? And I think a lot of the things we talk about here at the Atlantic Council regularly is the massive amount of data that we now have available to us that we are struggling to actually digest and turn into actionable information at a pace that actually kind of keeps up with the rate in which that information is coming through. And while we do have, and we will continue to have, a reliance on the intelligence community to help us understand threats, there is a massive wealth of information from data that actually private sector actors control and have access to. So as we think about kind of rebuilding, adapting the national security apparatus, how do you think we need to be working more effectively both with private sector actors, but also with allies and partners who inevitably play a really important role as we think about responding to these kinds of threats?
Well, let's start with the comment on the private sector. And I think Steve Hadley, who has a close association with the Atlantic Council, gave us, I think, a very wise, we spent time with him on a couple of occasions, some very wise thoughts about we have to build this machinery so the private sector is willing to participate. If we make it too hard, if we're going to play gotcha because we now have access to information that we wouldn't have otherwise had, it's going to be very hard for parts of the private sector to be able to want to share the information they have. Now, nobody's talking about wanton criminal activity and so forth, but there could be information that's uncovered here that might be part of that warning apparatus that, unless we set the rules right, it's going to be very hard for the private sector to want to participate. AI is going to be a very good case in point. We know this town is focusing on that with great attention right now, as it should. These large learning language models, these aren't the creation of government labs. These are coming out of the private sector. And if we're going to set guardrails around this, we're going to have the cooperation of the private sector. Just a word before we turn to Thom on allies. Everything we look at in terms of the thinking about the dangers that are here require allies. If there's one great piece of wisdom of those that built the modern national security establishment at the end of World War II, it was this idea that we're going to do this with partners and allies. We just cannot let that fragment. It's let me say the other side of that. It's essential, the partnerships that we're talking about and the allies, that come, the alliances that are part of this. And we're going to be building different frameworks. We're going to be taking on new issues and so forth. But without partners, where are we? And so it's just essential in the way we think about it.
And as we embrace this wider definition of national security, the country also needs to embrace a wider array of access to information. In Iraq and Afghanistan, an axiom that General Myers probably taught us was every soldier is a sensor, right? Yes, they're on patrol, but what they see and hear is important. Well, guess what? Every Ukrainian is a sensor today too. They're the ones sending home the photos and all of that. It's not a surprise that the Russian invasion of Ukraine was first made public. The IC was watching it, but it was a professor out in Monterey whose students had been tracking Google Maps and saw traffic jams at 4 in the morning along the Russian border with Ukraine. Why? Because armored vehicles were coming through. We talked to members of the intelligence community who said they could predict where the protests during Arab Spring were going to be better than those governments because they had access to Google Map searches for routes in and out of Tahrir Square. And so they knew the time. Think about the constellation of private satellites overhead that allow any citizen in major news organizations to do what only a government could have done decades ago. So Clementine, there's not really a system yet to embrace all of this new information, vet good from bad, but to ignore that is a peril.
I'm going to make a very quick plug for a piece that is going to be coming out very shortly by General Cartwright and General Justin Kennelly, our Air Force fellow here, about kind of a new approach to thinking about sensors and shooters in a more kind of data-driven era. So look out for that.
And did not know that. I was channeling you, Clementine.
So we've got an interesting question here from Austin Fulmer of the US Coast Guard. And I think, Andy, this links to your statement earlier about wishful thinking in the context of us not necessarily seeing the threat from Russia in 2014 as it was. His question, I think, relates to the converse of that, of seeing a threat maybe in a particular way, and will that come to fruition? So Austin's question is, do you think there is groupthink in Washington around China, around a conflict with China being painted as inevitable? How do we get out of that kind of thinking as part of the apparatus?
I think it's a great question. I'm glad it came up. I think the people I interact with, for the most part, don't see the inevitability of it. What they're really focused on is, are we in a position where the sense that the confidence that we might have in our ability to deter a conflict, might that be eroding such that the leadership in China should it choose the moment in which it would exercise an option of using force, say, against Taiwan, that it felt more confident than it should. I think the real debate is one about deterrence. And are there steps that we can take that would at least cause enough doubt in the thinking of those that would make those decisions to suggest the risk is just too great. And I'm less concerned in a sense about this notion of inevitability. I am more concerned about the potential erosion of a deterrent that we could present to forestall the idea that anyone that would choose to initiate conflict, again, say over Taiwan, would feel confident in their ability to do so.
And there are lessons from the Cold War. I mean, during the Soviet era, people talked about, the Soviet army, soldiers are 10 feet tall, great attack helicopters and all that. But if you lived in Moscow in those days, the country couldn't even pave the streets around the Kremlin, and there wasn't fresh fruit in the market year round. So it was rotten at the core, and now we know the Soviet army and the current Russian army is not very effective. Andy and I talk about similar demographic time bombs inside China. I mean, their decreasing population numbers could be catastrophic in ways that no country has ever managed. And oh, by the way, even though China has great technology, as awful as the forever wars were on the military and veterans, and of course on the citizens of those countries, the American military at least is a well-practiced, well-trained organization, love it or not. Russia was not, we see what happens. China was not. So I think the question about a groupthink is an important one, because let's not convince ourselves that China today is the monster like the Soviet Union of the Cold War, which turned out to have clay feet.
So final question. A key point that you repeat throughout the book is that militaries do not win wars. Only government can win wars by establishing lasting peace. So we've talked about a lot of different issues here. What do we do about this in terms of kind of thinking about the national security apparatus in a new way? What changes do you recommend to adapting this system to meet today's age of danger?
Well, Andy certainly highlighted it earlier, and we do end on a somewhat hopeful note, and it's this concept of joint interagency task forces. You know, not creating new structures like post 9/11, the 1947 national security machine that came out of World War II, that's a 47 Chevy, let's leave it in the garage. But let's be nimble and agile, bring together people now from all across the government, not just pin it on DOD. At any agency, bring them together, practice 4 times a year, make lists of what you might need should there be a data crisis, a food crisis, a crop crisis, another pandemic crisis. And the value of that is, even if you can't predict the specific crisis that's coming, when something does come over the horizon, it's not a pickup game. People know each other, the capabilities are there. That, I think, would really make a huge difference in helping us ride out this age of danger.
The genius that was in this country in the late 40s knew we were entering a complicated world and were prepared to take action to be ready for it. We need to have a similar activity right now, and we need to look at the array of the new problems, and let's design the warning machine and the action machine to deal with this set of problems, not necessarily the ones that were with us in the decades past. It's time we do it.
Thom, Andy, thank you so much. I hope that this has convinced everybody that you really should read this book. It's full of knowledge, both from you both, but everyone you interviewed, which I know is a wealth of different folks. Thank you for joining us. Thanks for our audience. Please stick with us. We're about to hear from Helene Cooper and our wonderful panel. Thank you.
Thank you, Claire.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
To our panel of experts in all things in this wonderful book, Age of Danger. We have Jacqueline Levy, we have Thom Wingfield, John Culver, and Aaron Sikorsky to talk us through climate, health, pandemics, China and Intel, and cyber. And I'm very honored to be here with you guys today, Thom, Shanker, and Andy. I'm very proud of you both. This book is wonderful. It's so accessible. And as somebody who had Shanker, and please excuse me, I'm going to have to call him Shanker because I don't know how to call him Thom. So there's going to be a lot of Shanker and Andy for the next few minutes. But as somebody who had Shanker as an editor at the New York Times for years, I could hear so much of his voice as I was reading, elevating topics that people think that they know everything about or they've heard it so much about. Shanker as an editor, or for me, I would go to him with a story idea, and by the time I was done talking to him, I'd walk out thinking I had the most fascinating, interesting, earth-shattering story in the world. And when you read this book, I see a lot of that gift in there. So congratulations on a wonderful, wonderful work. Very scary work. I'm going to just dive straight in to this because there's so much about this book that I found familiar and yet quite frightening, and a lot of frustration because you see the same themes again and again and again from one topic to the next. I want to start with Aaron, though, and climate. You're all over chapter 8, which if you've looked at this book, all the chapters have these one-word scary titles like, storms or what was the other one? Drones or germs or whatever. But let's do storms. You're all over chapter 8, which takes apart the very real threat that is climate change. You, in fact, describe a eureka moment that you had earlier in your career when you were working on the Mideast and Africa, and you realized that so much of the issues that you were dealing with had one thing very much in common that people weren't honing in on. Can you take us back to that?
Sure. No, thanks so much, Helene, and it's really a pleasure to be here. I found the book fascinating. So I was an analyst, right? And I was leading teams that were supposed to warn policymakers of risks of conflict and instability in the Middle East and Sub-Saharan Africa. And we realized on our teams that climate and environment issues were shaping these risks on a regular basis, right? They were playing a role in driving protests against governments, in conflicts at local levels between parties, but we didn't really have the skills or the tools on our team to understand and warn effectively of how climate and environment were playing that role. And so I got more interested in exploring that and playing a role within the intelligence community in trying to tackle these issues. I think, the reasons we struggled, and not that climate and environment haven't been covered by the intelligence community previously, but it was siloed off, right? There was a climate team, and then there were the regional teams, and the regional teams didn't have folks that necessarily had the scientific literacy, the data literacy to regularly bring that information in. And frankly, the culture wasn't such that information was privileged, right? If you had, I started as a terrorism analyst, if you had information that was warning of a terrorist attack, even if it wasn't very credible, even if it was fragmentary, that went to the top of the list, right? That was privileged in the culture of the intelligence community. Environment and climate issues didn't get that same level of attention, even though, as we see, as I'm sure we're going to see later this summer, as the El Nino effect comes online and we have ridiculously hot temperatures, unprecedented temperatures, it's creating instability, it's creating conflict, but it just wasn't given the same level of attention or effort or understanding.
Walk us through climate creating instability that leads to terrorism.
Sure, and it's not a direct line, right?
No,
and
I know, but it's like, but there's Yeah.
Exactly, and I think that's why it's such a challenge, frankly, for the intelligence community, is it's systemic risk, right? It's climate hazards exacerbating existing challenges. So you have, say, a country like Lebanon or Iran or Iraq. In recent summers, you've had extreme
Somalia,
heat waves.
yeah.
Somalia is another one, right? You've had extreme heat waves that have caused unprecedented droughts, demand for energy, demand for water, and then you have poor governance, right? So you have systems of distribution of water, distribution of energy that are unfair. Certain groups are excluded, right? That leads potentially to protests in the street. It leads potentially to individuals who can no longer farm, right? Who no longer have an economic pathway that they once had, being more interested or opportunistic in potentially joining terrorist or extremist groups that offer them an alternative, right? It also, when the government can't provide water or energy to communities and terrorist groups can step in, like ISIS, we saw in Iraq and Syria, right, and provide those services at times, that allows those groups to flourish. So it adds pressure on systems that are already, right, very fragile. And when you add repeated storms, repeated droughts, repeated heat waves, it increases risks of conflict and instability.
Now, so much of this book is about a lack of preparedness. It's like the knowledge is there, the intelligence is there, but we don't do enough about it. On the climate topic, though, is the world, for instance, ready for mass migration caused by climate change? Because we see so much, we've seen how immigration affects politics here in the United States, politics in Europe. We see the rise of these nationalistic governments that can lead to their own hosts of issues. Can you draw the line between climate change and what we may be seeing soon in the world confronting on sort of, is Europe ready for even more immigrants coming because of climate change in these vulnerable countries? And what after that, because we do need to be very prescriptive here. What should we be doing about this? How should we be thinking about this?
Sure. I mean, the short answer is no, we're not prepared for the amount of migration that we're going to see, and the pressures and the ways that governments and bad actors might try to weaponize that, right? As climate hazards become more intense, parts of the world are going to become unlivable, right? Either because the temperature is too high for outdoor activity, right? For farming, for agriculture. Most migration will initially be within countries, from rural areas to cities, but then eventually, as the cities become overwhelmed, that they will look to migrate elsewhere. And again, not climate change alone, but climate change plus other things. And we've already seen the response to waves of migration is often nationalist, closing borders, right? Those types of responses. It can create political turmoil within Western Europe, within the United States, frankly, that can then be exploited, right, by other bad actors. So it's going to create a lot of pressure on a system that is not set up to manage those risks. You asked, what can be done about it? I think, when I think about my intelligence community days and the warning machine that is talked about in this book, one way to get after this question is to put different teams of people together looking at these issues, right? I think we need to have a lot more co-creation of warning between the intelligence community and the U.S. federal scientific community, for example. Those who have the scientific background and knowledge and understanding climate models and climate systems to partner and pair up with their intelligence community counterparts who maybe have the regional knowledge or the country knowledge, right? And write products together, do the analysis together. I don't think we need to hire a bunch of climate scientists to work at CIA, but we need people who can talk to climate scientists and work with them and put out new information and new ways of tackling these issues so that our policymakers have the warning and the thinking ahead of time that they need on these issues.
I want to come back to talking to you a little bit about the U.S. military and climate, which the book touches on quite well. But let me jump for a minute, change the topic to germs. Jacqueline, one of the scariest chapters in Age of Danger is germs. Shanker and Andy, who say they're apolitical, write about one scene that jumped out at me, and that's the Obama National Security Team was doing a handover briefing on pandemics for the incoming Trump team, in which the authors, both Shanker and Andy, talked to named sources in the meeting on the record who said that the Trump people were all on their phones not paying attention as they were briefing them about coming pandemics. There's even a line in there that Michael Flynn would get off his BlackBerry. There's somebody who's quoted saying they were completely bored and they walked out of this meeting thinking, what was the point? Why did we even bother with that? In the end, COVID may well have ended Donald Trump's presidency. Why were we so unprepared?
Well, this is a pretty illustrative example of the ways in which we perhaps have the technology and the innovation to move forward and address these types of issues, whether it's pandemic preparedness, surveillance, or response. But the politicization of science has been something that's been in the spotlight since COVID and before, depending on whether you're talking about H1N1 or Ebola or previous outbreaks. It certainly was centralized and distributed across the entire community when we've seen this pandemic over the last couple of years. So I think that speaks to the disjointed framework that was mentioned earlier, the need for sort of centralized decision-making and responsibility and where that lies. The Prevent Pandemics Act, which was signed as part of the year-end spending package last year, included a more centralized administration-level office for pandemic preparedness. So on the one hand, perhaps that's just yet another piece in this apparatus that, as Andy mentioned, needs to be coordinated also across federal, state, and local jurisdictions. Or perhaps it can function as a centralizing authority in which to disseminate information to these more local public health departments and more regional spaces so that the question of who is responsible, which has come up in the earlier discussion, doesn't remain as we continue to confront these challenges.
But who should be responsible?
Well, it depends on who you ask, frankly. But if you look at the Prevent Pandemics Act, perhaps it's that new organization. Perhaps it's the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response, whose office has just been elevated into an operating division. The Pandemic and All Hazards Preparedness Act reauthorization is on deck for this year, which is the federal funding that gives money and authority to ASPR and BARDA and your whole sort of alphabet soup of public health agencies that have to, integrate but also work within their own specialties. And perhaps that's part of the issue because, as somebody mentioned, CDC wasn't designed as an emergency response authorization. So each of these federal entities and their sort of subsequent entities that they work with all have specific missions. And so there needs to be a more harmonized, coordinating group that's able to connect these dots. And when we talk about surveillance, even General Myers mentioned it's not sufficient and enough just to focus on that. That said, our surveillance infrastructure is woefully underdeveloped. COVID was the first time there really ever was federal funding to do that type of thing, which speaks to the sort of boom and bust nature, the feast or famine funding that we see. So whoever that ends up being, the sort of ability to connect those dots and centralize communications and both, vertically integrate these discussions and also being able to work with disparate agencies that have local responsibilities, whether it's to state, regional, or otherwise, so that, the hands are speaking to one another.
It feels though that we had just gone through Ebola, not we, the United States, but it was very much a huge story in 2014, 2015. And I remember at the time, I was in Liberia covering the Ebola pandemic, and Shanker was my editor, and he was assigning me stories as I was coming back saying, write about what it's like to return into, he made me write a story about what it was like to fly into Dulles Airport from Liberia in the middle of the Ebola pandemic. We certainly had warning at that point that this had the potential. I mean, we dodged a bullet with Ebola here in the United States, but we had plenty of warning at that point. Why did COVID go so poorly when you look at the federal response? Clearly, this is something that has happened in the past. We read you guys are talking about in Age of Danger, in the germs chapter, you guys start with the bubonic plague, but this is not something that's new to the world by any stretch.
So in 2016, pre-COVID was the most recent iteration of sort of the Federal Pandemic Preparedness Handbook. So it was there. It, though, stayed on the shelf a little bit at the beginning of the pandemic. Operation Warp Speed was something that the administration put into play that did end up being very successful. And I think that's one thing that came out of the H1N1 pandemic going a little bit further back because there was a big overpromise and then subsequent underdelivery of vaccinations. One other interesting thing people have spoken about DoD a couple of times. DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency, back in 2013, invested around $25 million into what was then a little-known company called Moderna. And these platform technologies, in this case mRNA, have had federal funding. And things like vaccine production are a lesson learned from previous outbreaks that were applied to COVID. But I think something that we're seeing in today's discussions is that there are so many moving parts that I agree that in the beginning there were balls dropped, and for whatever reasons those happened, there were other areas where there was a lot of work. And so you can find the successes and you can find the failures, but a lot of it is disjointed at the moment, and there needs to be that harmonization and centralization to the extent that you can leverage all of the capabilities you've got.
I have like a billion more questions for you, but I feel like she's. Let's move for a second to. We're not going to say cyber war anymore. We're just going to say war in the cyber arena, right? That's what we decided. Thom, can you describe for us how a cyber attack on the United States by Russia might play out? I mean, a real this sparks a war type cyber attack. Take us through a real world scenario and one that most keeps you awake at night.
Unfortunately, that's very easy to do. I'll even take Russia out of the equation, and you can put in either Russia, China, or smaller, scrappier, more dangerous adversaries. The types of threats would be the same. It is not a monolithic threat. That's the first thing to look at. When we look at what could be done in a worst-case scenario for red teaming the United States, we can see 4 or 5 distinct phases where different things are hit for different reasons. The only thing they have in common is that cyber is the primary vector. But at the very beginning, even before the decision to commit forces or to respond to fill-in-the-blank crisis, we could imagine different cyber attacks that would create multiple Katrinas across the country. And that would be because of geographical, red state, blue state, ethnic divides. We could see all sorts of things that could be brought
examples, like what? Like what? Somebody hit a school grid or like what?
You could imagine hitting 2 or 3 of the largest urban power grids.
Okay.
And that would disproportionately fall on certain groups of Americans and not fall on other groups of Americans. So it's not just the damage you're doing to the power grid or the immediately affected people, but it's the rancor that you're stirring up.
That sounds straight out of the Kremlin playbook.
And there may be others who are reading that book also.
Yeah.
So you can imagine that even before the beginning of that. But if a president fights through that and makes a decision to commit, we could imagine attacks on road, rail, air to keep our forces from moving either at all or quickly enough to get to where they need to be. And that greatly reduces our deterrent value at the beginning of a crisis. We can imagine and that's again targeting civilian infrastructure that the DoD relies on.
Yeah.
We could imagine targeting the forces, not so much the forces themselves, but making the area beyond where they have to go. Let's just say, in a Pacific example, beyond the second island chain, making that seem so dangerous by confusing sensors, cutting out position navigation and timing and other things. You can create a here there be dragon zone that would really make us think twice before crossing into that area. Mm-hmm. We've seen plenty of great books, awful books, about what an actual World War III between military forces would look like, and there's no reason not to expect that. And the last and most dangerous part, answer to your question would be, mostly that's where the books end, but we could imagine that a power that is not doing well in that kind of a war would want to have a strategic way to escalate to de-escalate or to shock to pause. Those are 2 of the current phrases we see. And so we may see policy advisors presenting cyber alternatives, not for narrow, discrete things, but rather to take the place of a limited nuclear strike. You want to kill X tens of thousands of Americans. You want to send that big message. There might be ways of doing that with cyber that could be very attractive, whether they should be or not, because they don't violate the nuclear taboo. They may be thought of as part of that rheostat we heard before that can be dialed up, dialed down, that could be undone later if necessary. So we can imagine there's this new strategic threat as well that, that is something to be considered at the back end of an otherwise successful conflict.
Okay, that's really like what? What would be, how could you use cyber to kill millions of people?
Okay, I'm going to stick with things that I've read in The Economist already, because I don't want to give anybody any bad ideas.
No, I feel like Professor Slughorn and Harry Potter telling, Voldemort when he was a kid, how to make Horcruxes.
Exactly. Don't want to end up like anyone in that story. Exactly. We can just take 2 or 3 examples of things that have happened and that did not turn out as badly as they could. Imagine a local water station where the levels of sodium hydroxide and other chemicals, or lye, that is used to kill biologics in our drinking water is increased by 1,000 or 10,000 times. Then not only have you poisoned water with a chemical that's already being fed into it, it's just a matter of dialing it up and down, but you've made the water so poisonous that boiling it makes it more poisonous. And you can reproduce that in as many water systems as you want to. When you take out, this is, obviously we've seen this in magazines. One more example, timing. No one's really looked at the position, navigation, and timing threat from the timing perspective. We talk about GPS. What if I lose Waze? I wouldn't even find my own way home. I've got that bad a sense of direction. But more important than that is the timing signal that is harmonized among all those satellites. You and I never see that, but power grids need that to sync up and phase power flows. So if one goes down and PNT goes down, there's no power cavalry coming. The financial system requires that to sync up the flow of money going back and forth. We see the need for that in 3 or 4 of our most important infrastructures. So here we have one single point of failure that would cascade out. So it's very much worth defending.
That is hugely frightening. Who is better, who is scarier in this, in sort of the scenario, in the capability area for the scenarios that you describe? Is it China or Russia?
Well, I think almost everyone in Washington has heard the line that Russia is a drunk with a knife and China is a chess player with a gun. And
I have never heard that line.
That makes me feel more original.
Thank you.
Thank you. But that gets you the idea that there might be a lower level of damage that could be done by the Russians, perhaps, but a higher amount of uncertainty, which is very hard to plan against. And at the other end of the spectrum, larger, more methodical, more well thought out, long-term capabilities that maybe are more rational, and we may have somewhat more time to prepare to deter, but would be much more dangerous for the preparation and the scale at which they could be methodically built.
Okay.
Sorry, I'll try to come back with a better answer next time.
No, that's great. Let's pivot to China. We've never heard that before.
Are you going to rebalance back the other way?
Yes, please, let's rebalance to Asia. For years now, we've been pivoting to China. Shanker and Andy argue in Age of Danger that we thought we had time, and now that time has passed and the threat is upon us. What do you say?
Well, yeah, we had time. I mean, the IC, I think Aaron knows this, we were warning about today 20 years ago with high fidelity, down to exactly how many ships and airplanes, advanced capabilities they would have. But for all the reasons mentioned by Shank and Andy in the book, the U.S. had other more high priority things to do. And so we underinvested over the last 20 years, especially in naval power, air power, all of the key munitions, anti-ship cruise missiles, although we're making some of that up now. But we had other priorities, so we weren't able to. It's a key misfunction, if you will, of the warning and then action models, which is warning is only effective if you actually sense the growing danger and then it's communicated effectively and believed and acted upon by policymakers and warfighters. So the IC's probably got a little bit of, I have a little bit of anger because I told four-star generals 20 years ago what today would look like, and even 10 years ago. And they believed me, but they
were busy with ISIS.
Weren't going to change priorities, right? So naval acquisitions hasn't been super great for the last 20 years. You know, we built littoral combat ships and a new class of aircraft carrier. I'm not sure either one is relative to China, relevant for a potential conflict with China. But I don't want to be the fourth horseman of the apocalypse here. So let me just say, the Chinese are deterred, right? There are many factors in deterrence. They're as invested in the international system that cyber action, like Thom described, would affect, right? They're as equally dependent on GPS for financial systems and transportation as we are. They are equally vulnerable to all the other kinds of disruptions. Their preoccupation for about the last 5 years has been that despite some efforts by both sides to avoid this, we're in a strategic rivalry. So the whole tenor and temperature of the negotiation, the dialogue or lack of dialogue, has really taken on aspects of the early Cold War, where we're in a rivalry. The Chinese realized this 10 years before we did. The US realized it by 2017 with the National Security Strategy and National Defense Strategy published within 6 months of each other. And so they've been through a phase of arraying themselves for this, and they're still doing it. They're hardening their society, hardening their system, ensuring that the government and the Communist Party can survive. The US is still in the early stages of that. So it's going to be, as we're all experiencing, more frothy, right? You have to get a consensus, not only inside the government, but then in the Congress, and then in the broader kind of population. Because kind of as the book really makes clear, it's really difficult to rack and stack all these priorities. Not everything can be number one at once. And so it's about building an agile system. So I think we'll get there, but to continue my metaphor that we're in early Cold War phase, I'm worried that what will finally get us there, if we get through it, is going to be a crisis. You have two great powers, both nuclear powers. The US has 1,550 strategic weapons capable of reaching China. The Chinese only have about 200, but they're building toward parity. And that's been confirmed by the Department of Defense in their last two white papers on China. And so right now we don't feel the imperative, because the political will, especially in the United States, is to not be seen as soft on China, not granting them concessions. Like the failed meeting at the Shangri-La Dialogue is because the Chinese defense minister, who was appointed earlier this year, is under US sanctions, under Majinsky sanctions imposed through
which the Pentagon was quite aware of when they decided to invite him to meet with Austin.
Well, but yeah, the thing is the US doesn't schedule, they did request a meeting, and the Chinese defense minister demurred because we weren't going to waive those sanctions in order to make the atmosphere of the meeting better. So they're making a point, and they're making a very broad point in turning down most of the US requests for dialogue right now. We're kind of in a timeout. I don't want to dwell on that too much. We'll get there. I think we're getting there, and you're going to get a more mature response, because the Chinese are deterred, as I said earlier. Their decision to use military force or these other means that, especially cyber means that Thom mentioned, is not, they're not waiting for the People's Liberation Army to tell them they think they can do it. The most ambitious, risky mission they would have ever attempted, using domains of warfare they've never done, like large-scale maritime conflict, amphibious invasion, naval blockade, continuous air power. They're worried that the US or Taiwan, or the two in combination, are going to create the conditions where they have to act. And there's a great line in the book that says, no power has ever gone to war thinking they would lose. That's true, except for the one case where it's really important to acknowledge that it isn't, and that's Japan, 1941. The Japanese understood, when they decided to attack Pearl Harbor, that their odds of success in a Pacific War with the United States were no better than 30%. But they did it anyway, because they felt the alternative was permanent secondary power status. And that's the problem that China would confront. in the event that the U.S. appeared to recognize Taiwan independence or to treat Taiwan as if the U.S. was an ally and had a mutual defense treaty with it, then they're going to have to cross a Rubicon at that point. They don't want to get there, which is why you're seeing, I think, such a stern stance, because what they want is what they had for the last 40 years, which is American restraint on Taiwan. China didn't have to worry about controlling Taiwan because the United States was doing most of it.
I have a billion questions. I want to follow up with you on that. But but we should shift at some point soon, after I ask my next question, to sort of a more prescriptive topics on each of these. But I wanted to ask you, and Shanker touched on this a little bit in the last discussion, just the idea of the Chinese military, which has not fought a war in decades. And what are there? You mentioned amphibious landing just now. That's one of the hardest things that any military can do. How frightened should we be of them? And can they even actually successfully can they actually take Taiwan?
They're a professional modernizing force. And the book talks about an important period in U.S. military DoD history, which was the Goldwater-Nichols Act of the late 1980s, which reoriented war planning and combat control to the combatant commands and away from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It took the U.S., I defer to General Myers and the authors, but it took us like 20 years to really have that working where we could do, like we did in Operation Iraqi Freedom, fully integrated air tasking orders, fully integrated joint service operations. So the Chinese started that in 2015. So they're 8 years in, and it's going about as you would expect. It's hard. It's very hard, especially to build a joint culture for the kind, and they're doing this because they realize, and they were taught this by the United States, to prevail on the 21st century battlefield, you have to generate combat power through highly integrated, informatized, meaning information dominant, joint operations. That if you're trying to have each service fight its own war, you're going to lose against a foe like the United States or against any foe who emulates the United States. So that's their goal, and they're not there yet. Now, I'd have to say, though, that while the U.S. has a lot of experience over the last 20 years in low-intensity combat and counterinsurgency, we have very little experience over the last 70 years in large-scale maritime operations, actual naval combat at sea, or air power assertion against a peer. So
but nobody has that.
Well, but here's the thing: if this war happened over Taiwan or against South China, over the South China Sea, we'll be fighting in China's front yard within coverage of their land-based air defense systems, which are arguably the best in the world, outside of the Moscow ABM system. Mm-hmm. We have to flow force around the world. Mm-hmm. They have the capacity to strike every base we have in the Pacific. That's one of the pillars they broke. And so it's not going to be easy for them, but it's not going to be easy for any of them. And I'm talking just about military aspects. If you thought the global pandemic was bad for supply chains and the global finances and the economies, this would make that look easy. I mean, if the two greatest economic powers and the largest trading powers in the world go to war, there are few winners in that. Maybe Putin will somehow luck out. I don't know. But it's that kind of thing that if you're going to do this, you have to get outside of the Pentagon, who does it better than anyone. They're the only ones who really do strategic planning, as far as I can tell. And you've really got the olive agency and the broader civil discourse on exactly how to deter that kind of threat, and then how to think about mitigating some of the aspects that could materialize even before you're into a kinetic conflict with a nuclear power.
I would much rather ask all my own questions, but I'll be generous and ask a couple of these. This is for either John or Thom. This is this Austin Fulmer guy again with the U.S. Coast Guard.
He's good.
He likes this drunk with knives analogy. If we continue the metaphor of Russia as a drunk with Russia was a drunk with a gun, and China
drunk with a knife.
Oh, that was the drunk with a knife? And China, okay, Russia is a drunk. You guys know this? People say this.
Yeah.
Russia is a drunk with a knife, and China is a chess player with a gun. I thought China was the chess player with a knife and Russia was the drunk with the gun.
They both have nukes, so it's kind of a metaphor that fails early.
How would China, okay, if we continue this metaphor, whatever it is, how would China view the U.S. in those terms? Are we the...
You want me to come up with a metaphorical cartoon of...
A protracted
That's
metaphor,
what Austin
maybe?
wants.
Oh, I'm going to fail here. We're sort of a giant that keeps falling down. I don't know what's in our hand, whether it's a gun or knife or a pizza, but we keep.
You just did that on the spot. That's
you have
really good.
The United States, which is an unparalleled historic power that has now, by China's count, suffered 4 catastrophes that probably would have brought down any lesser power, from the decision making over the invasion of Iraq, the global financial crisis, pandemic response, and then the rise of populism. So it's kind of like they have sort of the same attitude that Putin may, which is, yeah, things look bad now, but they're going to have an election next year. Let's wait and see what happens.
Yeah. Everybody's sort of waiting for us to fall down again, or however. From Noah Vaughn with Public Democracy. Thinking back to Japanese, and this again is for either John or Thom, thinking back to Japanese internment camps and the severe mistreatment of Asian Americans during COVID, is there any contingency regarding xenophobic threats in the wake of conflict with China? How do we care for our own citizens in a war with China? It's a pretty good question.
That's an excellent question, and one can imagine China wanting to mobilize not just the expats that are temporarily overseas, but those that are overseas for an extended period of time, and even second or third generation to stir up the ethnic feeling and the Han identity. So there's no reason at all to think that that would not be part of the playbook. I hope the United States has matured since the days of Korematsu in 1944.
But we haven't, because, well, we have a little bit, but there's definitely some strains of that during COVID.
No argument on that. But I believe that there are more diverse sources of information.
Yeah.
And I think that by maintaining that diversity of information, that's our first line of defense against that happening again. So that and fidelity to our Constitution to make sure that we're not turned into the bad guy they want us to be.
Early in the book, Shanker and Andy talk about, there's a great line in there where they talk about generals are excellent at training for the last war. And I'd like to turn this now to sort of, let's try to do better than that and look at sort of prescriptive things that we could be doing now in each of your areas, starting with Aaron. What we didn't talk about when we were chatting earlier is the Pentagon and how much climate change affects the military. I mean, the Pentagon, as both Shanker and Andy write in their book, doesn't have the luxury of arguing politically about climate change. They can't sit around and dicker. We have bases that are in areas that are in danger. The military is the one that ends up having to deal with this stuff all the time anyway. What should the Pentagon be doing at this point to prepare for what's already here?
Yeah, and to give credit where credit is due, I would say the Pentagon is doing a lot of what it should be doing and has been for a couple of decades now. I think, you've seen each of the services, for example, has come up with a climate change strategy in the past year. They've got an Office of Global Resilience, AKA Climate, in the Office of the Secretary of Defense for Policy that is thinking through how to manage these issues. You've got logisticians who are gaming this out. I've been spending a lot of time with them lately and looking at the Indo-Pacific of how do we move people and material to that theater in an age of climate change, right? When maybe you have storms affecting things here in the US as well as in the region. Just look at what happened at Guam, right, the past week.
Then there's that military exercise that you guys wrote about with where there's some huge storm that comes in the middle of some.
Exactly. I think they're on the right track. I think they have a couple of challenges. One is still that integration piece, so that you're not just doing war games on climate hazards, but you're doing your regular war games on your operations for whatever issue, and you're layering climate into that? Because as I'm listening to the fellow panelists talk, these issues, climate change affects all of them, right? And it's a shaping threat, right? And so you need to bring those together. So all of the regional combatant commands need to think about how climate change will shape their work and their AORs, shape the work of allies and partners. I think that's another thing the military is starting to do, but can do even more, is what are we expecting our allies and partners to be able to do for us? And if they're affected by climate hazards, how does that impact their ability to show up when we need them? And what do we need to share with them? What tools, what technologies, how can we help them? And I think that conversation's happening a lot in NATO right now. The other challenge, though, I think, is personnel and training. And again, like I said earlier, I don't think it's a matter of hiring a bunch of climate scientists, but giving people throughout the military the tools they need that will help them do their jobs better as it relates to climate change. And so that means it's really different depending on your job, right? What you need. It's not going to be the same for everyone, but so that you can bring that climate lens to either your strategy or your tactics or your logistics, as I said earlier, and you get answers to questions right. Because my concern is if you're not bringing that climate lens and you're making plans without an understanding of how many more storms or more precipitation we're expecting in certain places, you're going to show up and you're going to get things wrong.
And that's just looking at sort of the military maneuvers that they have to do as part of their job anyway.
Yep.
That's not even touching climate changing the world that we live in. The military ends up being the one having to deal with this.
Absolutely. No, and that's another piece of it, is the response piece, right? Whether it's humanitarian assistance, disaster response abroad, or support to civil authorities here at home. I mean, you talk to the National Guard, and the number of person hours they spend fighting wildfires has gone up so much in the past 5 years, and they're already worried about this next summer. You know, we're going to be launching a tracker in a couple weeks at the Center for Climate and Security of military deployments in response to climate hazards, and they're happening on every continent, right? Every military, so it's not just us, and they're being asked to do more and more all the time.
How bad is this summer going to be? Since you're here, you might as well tell us.
I'm really worried. I mean, if the El Nino predictions that NOAA, NASA, and others are making, which amplifies temperature, right, on top of the climate changes we already have, it's going to be significant heat waves in places that perhaps don't normally get that hot. I mean, we've already seen the wildfires in Alberta. We've seen a hottest day ever, I think, in Shanghai this past week. You had that in Vietnam and Southeast Asia earlier. So the heat is going to be a problem, and I'm guessing you'll see militaries deployed to fight fires, provide relief, manage issues. I mean, last summer in the UK, their busiest military runway melted due to the heat wave that shut the base down, right? So it's going to be challenging.
Jacqueline, I'm told that since this is the Atlantic Council, I should have been asking questions that have allies, the word allies in them. So if ever there was a threat that needed unity among allies to address, it's pandemics. Is that happening? And if it isn't, how should that be happening?
It is happening. There's a pandemic fund that was set up where the U.S. has recently, it's a G7 effort for preparedness and response, focusing primarily on low and middle income countries, since pathogens know no borders. And the U.S. has recently committed $250 million to that. So in the scheme of pandemic preparedness funding, it could perhaps be more, but there is that joint effort to at least keep those lines of communication open. As far as ways to approach this, thinking about impacts of climate change on potential terrorism, like Erin was talking about, well, it certainly impacts pandemics and outbreaks and potential for that. You've got melting permafrost, revealing potential pathogens going on in there, flooding, storm damage. We remember the cholera outbreaks in Haiti. And so this idea that vector-borne diseases could be spreading as ecology changes make insects and animals change their environments. And so you start seeing things become endemic that weren't before. And so that connectivity is incredibly crucial, because as we have these sorts of climate events, you're going to have subsequent outbreak events that perhaps we haven't seen before. And as we've spoken about so many times today, need to be prepared to jump into. And so to that end, it's really important to consider our public health infrastructure as an element of our critical infrastructure in the US, which at this moment, we really don't, as far as the resources that we commit and the planning that we have. Until the pandemic, until the COVID-19 pandemic, I should say, individual public health agencies were able to do whatever surveillance they were able to do. But as far as federal surveillance, the CDC Advanced Molecular Detection Initiative had a roughly $30 to $35 million a year budget. And they started to build this pathogen surveillance infrastructure essentially from scratch in the mid to late 2010s. And so they went, speaking of feast or famine funding, from 30 to 35 million to around $4.5 trillion. But that's going to hit a fiscal cliff at some point. And at that point, we will have hopefully a robust infrastructure here that we can then harmonize more globally. But what happens when the money runs out? And so that the need for more sustained funding across all of these elements, whether it be the innovation ecosystem, preparedness, or a surveillance framework, all sort of in concert need to be adapted more globally and more regularly.
Thanks. Thom, if there was one prescriptive thing you could come up with that you could make happen in the preparation for war in the cyber arena, for defending in the cyber arena, what would it be?
I think it would be having an enlarged idea of what cyber is. And by that I mean the idea that the cyber commander should have organic electronic warfare and information operations capabilities. Our adversaries are great at integrating those things, and we are more stovepiped. We need to be better at integrating cyber with kinetic things, so we're defending the right things and we're supporting the right things, not in two separate universes, which is too much the case now. I think we also need to have an expanded view of cyber where we just don't think of operations at the minimalist end of the competition space, but we have plans for the maximalist end of the competition space, for more robust deterrence, and also moving into the conflict space, whether it's minimalist to not make things worse than they are but still prevail, or if necessary, maximalist to provide that kind of deterrent capability. And then finally, I think the idea of testing all these things, putting them together in a way so that it's not just well-worded academic pieces or brilliant panels throwing ideas around and doing that, but rather we're doing the nuts and bolts, we're actually doing the doing together.
I would love to see the tabletop exercise on that and to actually be able to write about it in a way that I could understand.
Congressionally passed laws and authorities to enable it.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
John, I've been warned that we're out of time. We're running out of time. So this is my last question. Many Europeans don't see China as the threat that the United States does. How do we get on the same page with our allies on how we view China going forward?
Well, I think that's changed a lot in just the last few years because NATO has come under, some members have come under Chinese economic pressure, especially Norway, basically Lithuania, any country that tilts too openly toward Taiwan, even as sympathy as a democratic power.
Yeah.
And so things that were hard to do, like serious conversations about Huawei a few years ago, are a lot easier now. Because the Chinese behavior has been abhorrent in many domains. Their human rights violations against their northwestern Uyghur population, their Muslim minority population, their crackdown on democracy in Hong Kong, their increasing military actions around Taiwan, are all building greater acknowledgement in Western Europe among our allies and especially in East Asia that this isn't just an American problem. And so I think we're getting more conversations through new virtual kind of organizations like the Quad with India, Japan, the US and Australia, or the AUKUS agreement, which isn't just about submarines between us, the Brits and the Australians. That's going to bring, I think, greater cooperation and more of a shared vision about the nature of the threat, not in a hysterical way, and then how we need to deal with it in a more united way.
You guys have been awesome. You're great. This has been so interesting for me. This book is wonderful. Thank you all. Thanks to all three of you, and thank you, Shanker and Andy, for giving us this.